139. Hayley will be putting that on the screen. So it's verses 13 to 18. Probably, dare I use this phrase, the more famous part of Psalm 139. Don't let that kind of stop you from reading all of Psalm 139. If I say during your own time, rather than during my sermon, that will be a benefit. But if it's going downhill, then if nothing else, read the Bible. You'll get more out of it otherwise. So, Psalm 139, verse 13. For you created my inmost being. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. Just amazing words that are penned there in Psalms, talking about God's love for us. And that kind of, it's almost beyond God's love is what it's really referring to. Today is, I haven't forgotten Mum, today is Mothering Sunday. My mum being in the congregation here this morning. And I am very grateful for I'm not going to get you up the front or embarrass you too much, but these past 47 years, I know, I don't look it, thank you, stop it please, stop it. These past 47 years, my mum has done an incredible job. Some of you might be sitting there thinking, well, she could have done a little bit better, but she did her best, okay? And maybe I'm at fault slightly in the way I've turned out. But I want to tell you about somebody who loves me more than my mother does, okay? And you probably guessed by now who I'm referring to. And that's being not my wife, okay, but God. God loving me even more than my mother. Now, Hayley just mentioned this morning that actually, yes, today, I always call it Mothering Sunday rather than Mother's Day. Not to kind of, we love our American cousins, absolutely. But I think there's something special about the word Mothering Sunday, or mothering, as opposed to mothers, because as Hayley suggested, there are so many more people that have been involved in our lives than just our mothers. For me, obviously, yes, my mum, some know her as Mo, others know her as Maureen, but there's also been, and still is, some of these people are still with us, some aren't, but there is my Auntie Joan as well, who has done a wonderful job in mothering me. Many years ago, my mum's mum, used to come round fairly regularly, and I thought her job to begin with was just to tell me off, but I realised it was much more than that. Much more than that, it wasn't, she didn't. So there's my gran. Now there's all these ones, I don't know if it's the same in your house or not, but you have aunties, and you've always called them auntie this and auntie that, but actually you later find out there is no relation whatsoever to you. But they are wonderful people. So there is Auntie Pat. There is our very own Auntie Jean. She's known me for a few years. There's Auntie Joy, Auntie Jo, Auntie Sheila as well, all who have mothered me and probably told me off on more than one occasion. But there's also been other people, as I've kind of grown up, and as I've moved away from the area, moved away from home, people like, you won't know these people like Dorothy and Sally, who have kind of taken me under their wing and mothered me. And there was also, when I grew up, there were the ladies in the street in which I grew up in. I don't know if you had these, if you grew up in a street, we grew up in a cul-de-sac, and there seemed to be eyes everywhere. You couldn't do or go anywhere without it being reported back to your parents what exactly you'd been up to. And that was Ash Way in Wollaston in the 80s. But there was Mrs. Clark. She lived at number 14, and later they moved up to the top into a bungalow right at the very end. And I am very grateful for this day. And you will be, after this story, you will all be very grateful for Mrs. Clark and her watching what was going on. So Mrs. Clark lived at the end of our road. Now, behind our houses, it was a slight kind of slope going down. There was a quite a big-ish but low-level hedge, and beyond that, lower down, then was a field or a couple of fields that were behind our house. Our house backed onto this field, and we were on the same side as Mrs. Clark, who lived up the top, who also backed on to the same field. And so quite often, there used to be quite a few of us that used to go and play in these fields, mess around. There used to be a stream right down in the bottom that, I mean, it's disgusting nowadays when I think about it. But the disgusting part was not the building of the dams, but actually the reality was there was a lot of cow poo in there as well. I don't know if that's where the love of cows came from. I'm not quite sure. But used to slop this, well, basically slurry around the place in the pond and make these dams and have a whale of a time down there. Now, there was one time that I went into this field. Now, at the end of this, my mum might say this story, I've maybe slightly exaggerated it, or it may be slightly different than how I see what happens. But I was about 8 years old, and it was late spring, and I don't know if this activity is frowned upon today or not, but around late spring is when the frogs lay all their frog spawn, lay all their eggs. As I say, at the back of our house, in the back of the garden, there was a hedge. And in that hedge, when it was wet, the spring rains came, and there used to be kind of ponds or wetlands that kind of were just there. And that was where the frogs lay their eggs. So I would go and collect frog spawn to watch them grow. I had a red bucket with a yellow handle, and I took that with me. I climbed over our stile that Dad had made between our garden and the field, and I went off to collect some frog spawn into this field. The field was a grass field. It was probably April-ish time. The rains have happened. It was growing beautifully. It was lush. It was green. There was nothing in that field apart from me, my red bucket with a yellow handle, and a 17-hand chestnut stallion, unbroken, was in this field with me, unbeknown to me at the time. 8-year-old me, 17-hand, unbroken chestnut stallion, a red bucket with a yellow handle, currently empty. Mrs. Clark, she was in her garden. She had a rake. It was probably her pride and joy. It had a wooden shaft with 16 prongs coming out of it. She was there tilling her newly cultivated seed bed, ready to sow, making it nice and flat, ready for planting her seeds. As she tilled her garden, there was the hedge and then the field that I was in, with the red bucket, with the yellow handle and the 17 hands, unbroken stallion. She was just there, minding her own business, but she was watching. She was seeing all that was about to unfold. Well, oops, have I lost my place? For those of you who might be one step ahead, knowing me with an empty bucket and a horse in the field, you know that that horse was after one thing, what potentially could be in that bucket. And for that horse, it meant food. So this horse, this 17-hand chestnut, unbroken stallion, head lifted from eating the grass, it saw me and it started to gallop towards me. Across the field it came. I can remember it as clear as if it was yesterday. Its mane was flowing back. Tail was up in the air. The grass and the mud off the hooves were being flung absolutely everywhere. There was steam pouring out of its nostrils, and foam was starting to gather in the corner of its mouth. Its powerful legs drove him on, what seemed to be like 10 yards astride, all towards little 8-year-old me, with the red bucket with the yellow handle. Mrs. Clark, she moved as fast as she possibly could towards the hedge that separated her garden and the field. My now bucket that was full of frog spawn. She started waving the rake with the wooden shaft and the 16 prongs. She was waving it as if she was a mighty warrior. She wasn't just waving it, she was yelling at the top of her voice, "Quiet!" Mrs. Clark turned into a warrior with immeasurable decibels, coming towards me and the horse, telling me there was danger ahead. Well, by now, the horse's hooves, that horse, that chestnut 17-hand, unbroken stallion hooves were stomping towards me. The ground was causing tremors as it came. I felt the tremors in my little size 1 feet. My probably red wellies that I was wearing. My eardrums had been alerted to Mrs. Clark. I looked up from my full bucket of frog spawn. The great joy instantly turned into fear as I saw this oncoming maelstrom towards me. I turned and I ran towards home, towards that stile that my dad had built, to be able to climb over it, to be back safe in the garden. But I was stuck in that field. Every stride I took forward, the impending beast gained at least 50 more. My bucket, my precious cargo inside, still by my side until I could carry it no more. It fell to the floor. Those poor frog spawn, they never had a chance, did they? I must muster the energy to keep running, to keep moving away. The horse had stopped proudly over its defenseless victim. It bent down its mouth opened to take a chunk, and the chunk was my right shoulder, right there, on my shoulder. I fell to the floor, but I knew I must keep going. I held my shoulder, my red bucket. I never did know what happened to that red bucket after. Maybe somewhere in that field, some archaeologist in years to come will uncover that red bucket with the yellow handle. But Mrs. Clark, she saved my life. Those ladies in that street that kept on seemingly dobbing me in, I am so thankful for Mrs. Clark watching all that happened. And not just watching, but actually that motherly instinct kicked in, and she went from quiet Mrs. Clark to a warrior. She was out for that horse, and I think she went round to the farmer and gave him a piece of her mind afterwards. But unless she shouted and alerted me, I could have been, let's not be too dramatic about this, but I could have been stomped to death. I could be here no more. Little 8-year-old Jonathan gone forever. Mrs. Clark saved my life. Now, I don't know, Mum, if that is exactly as it happened. Ish. Thereabouts. I might have slightly over-exaggerated, but I want to make a point from all of that God is looking out for us. And in that reading that we read, and I think this is wonderful, you created me from my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I've been thinking about that. Quite some time. From the very moment of conception until this very second, God has been thinking and gazing upon us. Every action of his is for you. Now, our mothers, my mother I know for sure, she has been looking out for my every step. And I know even now that she doesn't shy away, and rightly so, she doesn't shy away from saying, Jonathan, you've overstepped the mark. Jonathan, that's not right. Jonathan, think about that again, of what you should do. She's not afraid still to tell me off. And that's fine, and that's okay, because no matter how old we are, I think we all still need correcting. But there is a God who put that special thing into mothers. Your mothers, our mothers' ways of loving, of being them, came, I believe, from God. Now, one of the things that I think is incredible, that God knew you before your mother did. God knew when you were conceived. On that first day, when that connection was made, before your mothers knew, God knew you existed. And that for me is a marvelous and wonderful thing, that when we read the whole of Psalm 139, we get to see the massive impact that God can have on our lives if we want him to. The message today is a simple message, but I think very profound. One, of course, of gratitude for all those earthly mothers of ours. It is right, it is biblical to give respect to them. But there is one who knows us better than anyone, whose thoughts, plans, and workings are all for us. There is a God, as we relook at this passage today, as I've just said, that God knew you existed before your mothers did. Your whole life, he has been for you. Maybe, just like Mrs. Clark, maybe he's shouting in your direction. Sometimes we can take that idea of, to use that phrase, God shouting, as, oh, God's angry, God's cross. I could have looked up. I could have seen Mrs. Clark shouting and just thinking, oh, she doesn't want me to have any fun. She doesn't want me to be collecting frog spawn. She wants me to let it all go. She's not really for me. But she was. All of that shouting that she was doing was for my protection. She couldn't physically. Wouldn't it have been amazing if that story ended with her vaulting over the fence with her prong and then doing some ninja stuff on that horse? But she didn't. All she could do from that distance was shout at me to alert, you are in danger. If you continue on the track that you're on, Jonathan, you will be in danger. You need to move. You need to run away. That's what Mrs. Clark was shouting about. She wasn't shouting at me in a cross way. It was for my protection. So maybe God is shouting at you. But if you feel that he is, if you feel that, all I get from God is this anger, in that sense, maybe actually if you stop to listen, maybe it's about your protection, the things that you don't see. I was too fixated on my red bucket with the yellow handle, with the frog spawn in, to know that 17-hand chestnut unbroken stallion was racing towards me at speed. So I want to encourage us all today to listen. Now it might be just like Elijah. We remember Elijah in that cave and all that happened, the earthquake, the wind, and everything that came towards him, and God was not in that. It was in the whisper, the still, small voice. And maybe that's how God is talking to you today, in that still, small voice. But maybe like 8-year-old Jonathan, maybe we're too engrossed in what we're doing to hear that still, small voice. And sometimes, just sometimes, maybe God needs to shout to get our attention. So I pray today, as I close, that you will hear God's voice. Amen.